共第20次全国代表大会在16号即将举行，到底习近平第3次的连任之路是否会出现变化？全球高度的关注。我们今天非常荣幸，也可以访问到著名的中国问题专家，同时也是美国哈佛大学甘乃迪政府学院 Tony Sach 赛奇教授。他是继傅高义教授之后，美国精研中国问题的大师，并且他还精通中文。在今天就请 Tony Sach 教授来跟我们一起分析中共20大会对未来美中台的关系产生什么样的变化。Yeah, Professor Sach, it's so good to see you after so many years. And I would like to start our dialogue today with the question regarding CCP's 20大. And Professor, everybody knows that you are a renowned expert on China issues and have researched and observed China's politics, economy, and public policies. The 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party is not only a major event in China, but has also attracted global attention. In the National Congress, there are usually no discussion, but rather making announcement on important conclusions. And based on your observation, what issues may cause concerns for the U.S. and the whole world?
Yes, likewise, it's great to see you again. I think what we're going to see, I mean, it's already obvious that Xi Jinping is going to cement his position as the supreme leader in China. And that does have policy consequences, which means that I think we're going to be seeing continuity rather than any significant change, which I think means, for example, for outsiders looking in, the continuation of the COVID policy, which of course has disrupted supply chains and has made China's global integration more problematic. But I think also what we will see is an emphasis on what he talks about as being the new global order and the need for China to strengthen its security. So what does that mean in practical terms for the world outside? I think it means, first of all, that China will continue to pursue, as far as is possible, agreements with those other countries that do not accept a Western-dominated global order. The obvious example being Putin in Russia, but also Iran and a number of other countries scattered across the globe. I think secondly, it means that China will continue its push to be what Xi Jinping says is a rule maker of global norms rather than a rule taker. And that means in organizations such as the UN human rights regime, it's going to keep pushing against that to make sure that its interests are represented and those of the West are suppressed. I think it also means that it will push to have more influence in international organizations, particularly those that are concerned with setting global standards for new industries. And I think the last point I would just say, which might have some global relevance, is that I think one of the things it has taken away as a lesson from what has happened in the Ukraine is it needs to isolate itself more from possible constraints and pressures from the West. So getting more independence in terms of Western technology, financial markets, and trade more generally.
Mm-hmm. As everybody knows that during every National Congress, it symbolized the power reshuffle, as well as the future direction for China in the next 5 or even 10 years, as Xi Jinping might reveal who will be his future successors and who are the likely candidates, you guess, and how will this impact China's diplomatic and economic landscape in the future?
Well, of course, we don't know. We will know in a week's time. But I think if you look at the structure of who's coming to the Congress and who's likely to be in the Central Committee, they are overwhelmingly acolytes or people placed by Xi Jinping. So that means he's got a really strong grip on the party apparatus. In terms of successor, that is more difficult to say because really in the process in the past, that successor would have been identified at the last party Congress, and that was not the case. That also clearly indicates that Xi Jinping has no desire to hand over the reins of leadership to anyone else. And a specific successor, I think might be difficult to identify at this party Congress, in part because some of those who I thought 5 years ago might have been successors are probably now getting too old to take over. So we'll need to look at, who is young that might be appointed. We do know there'll be a significant turnover. 2 or 3 of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, formerly the most powerful organ, will step down. A further 8 of the Politburo will step down. And again, that gives Xi Jinping great capacity to appoint his supporters to those key positions. I suspect that the new Politburo will be overwhelmingly stacked, maybe up to 80% of supporters of Xi Jinping, and of course, strong dominance in the Standing Committee of the Politburo. So it means that whatever happens, Xi will remain firmly in control, accidents notwithstanding. And it will be important to look at, who moves up the ladder. One of the key questions, of course, is who will be premier. As we know, Li Keqiang will have to step down. And there, I think there's a mix of potential candidates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Xi Jinping will remain strongly in control. Professor Sach, you published a book this year titled From Rebel to Ruler, 100 Years of the Chinese Communist Party, and which is already available in the online bookstore. And last year marked the 100th anniversary of the funding of the CCP, but due to the impact of the pandemic and pressure from home and abroad, President Xi's plan to celebrate was disrupted. Now China still maintains the zero-COVID policy. And do you think China will continue to lock down the country from the world? And what is Xi's really intention behind the lockdown policy?
Yeah, at a certain point, they're going to have to start relaxing the policy. I mean, we know it's been terribly damaging to China's economic prospects. And of course, it has massively disrupted international trade, international investment into China. Having said that, though, I think there is a fair degree of support amongst the elite, despite growing frustration, I think, amongst the population with these sort of unpredictable and sporadic lockdowns. And I say that for 3 primary reasons. The first is that the rural healthcare system in China is incredibly weak. If they had a serious outbreak of Omicron or whatever comes next, I don't think the rural healthcare system could cope with it. It would be massively overwhelmed, leading to high numbers of deaths, which would undermine the credibility of Xi and the Communist Party itself. Secondly, because of vaccine nationalism, they have not brought in the better vaccines from overseas, which means that they're less effective. They are effective to some extent, but less effective against the disease. And thirdly, the rollout of the vaccinations has been very poor. They didn't really have an aggressive program to vaccinate, for example, those over 60 who might be most vulnerable. So it's going to be tricky to lift the COVID policy. I suspect there will be no major significant shifts until after next year's Lianghui meetings, which will occur in March. But what I would imagine they're looking very carefully at what is happening in Macau and Hong Kong to see whether that is something they might be able to slowly adapt. And perhaps what they'll do is they'll begin with lightening some of the policies outside of Beijing, but keep Beijing still heavily protected. I mean, one thing they could do is think about the nature of the lockdowns. I mean, we've seen, 80 odd or so in the last month or more. And I wonder how many of those were really necessary and how many are just local officials showing fealty to Xi Jinping by locking down the city, and of course not wanting to be seen to make a mistake. So that could give them at least some flexibility. But I think, Rebecca, also in your question is the fact that this is not only damaging to the economy and therefore also in terms of global supply chains. I think the Chinese leadership has also realized that their isolation is costing them in terms of promotion of their own ideas in international fora. And so we've seen more recently, Li Jianshu, Wang Yi, Wang Qishan, and of course Xi Jinping himself finally traveling overseas. So I think they've realized that you can't just do this like we are on Zoom. At some point, you need to have real personal contact to project their influence and their ideas.
And Professor, from the Made in American policy during the Obama administration, and then the U.S.-China trade war in the Trump administration, and now to the technology war under the Biden government, what will be Xi Jinping's policies to fight this long-lasting war with the United States?
Yes, I think, the Chinese leadership have thought for a while that the U.S. intention is really to contain China and to isolate it as far as is possible. Now, in some areas, that's just not feasible. Global financial markets, it's a multi-trillion-dollar engagement. But we are seeing reorientation in other areas, trade, investment, as I talked about earlier. One of the key areas, I think, and this is where the Biden administration, as you rightly say, is focusing, is around the question of tech and AI. And China strategy, I think, is sort of twofold here. The first is what I would call geoeconomic risk mitigation, and that includes its phrases of decoupling, dual circulation, made in China 2025. And the objective there itself, I think, is twofold. First is to protect itself from overexposure to the West and therefore possibility of dramatic sanctions. But I think secondly, it's to invest in what it sees as the industries of the future and try and gain a dominance in those industries. And I think one of the things that Beijing leadership has recognized is the country that controls global standards really has tremendous global power. And I think that's the play they're trying to make. Whether they're successful or not, that we can argue about, and that's a different issue. But I think that's what they're trying to do. And the second aspect of their response is really to diversify engagement with the West to more influence in Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And so diversifying sources and access differentially across the world. So I think they're aware of this. They see it as a key problem. I think they see it as an ongoing struggle. It also explains, I think, Xi Jinping's unwavering support for President Putin with relationship to the invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, the Chinese Communist Party used to believe that companies should serve the country. Over the past few years, Xi Jinping has imposed tighter control over the private sector. After the 20th National Congress, do you think Xi will open up the economy or will he continue his own path? And how will it impact the global economy?
Business, whether it's state or private, and including foreign business, has always been there to serve the interests of the party. I mean, there's no difference there. And in fact, we look historically, the Chinese Communist Party has always had a very ambivalent and often antagonistic view towards private industry. When it was founded in 1921, it was with the express purpose of destroying the capitalist system. And of course, we know in the early 1950s, it abolished private enterprise. Now, Xi Jinping can't do that. Private enterprise is far too important for China's economic growth. But what he can do is put pressure on business to make sure that it does not grow too big, too independent, or too powerful, and serves more effectively the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think foreign investment, foreign trade, foreign investment, I think the party has always seen it as a necessary evil to move things along. But I think perhaps it now sees it as less necessary. That doesn't mean there's no role for it, but it does mean that it will be welcome in those areas where China has no alternative and where it serves the Communist Party's interests. And I think that will have major ramifications for how global businesses think about their investment and engagement in China. Having said all that, of course, for global companies, the attraction of a 1.4 billion person market is almost irresistible. And I think we're going to see those tensions playing out between legislation in Washington and objectives of Wall Street.
Yeah, Professor, you once mentioned that Xi believes in historical materialism. However, with the rising tensions between the U.S. and China, do you think the lasting confrontations will lead to greater economic division in the world?
Yes, I mean, Xi argues, underlying that, I think, is another important point that we tended to ignore for a long time when looking at China, is that it is a communist party, and it does have Marxism as the basis for its analysis of both domestic issues and the global order. And I think we kind of pretended that wasn't the case. We kind of wished that China was becoming something else. But what we see with Xi Jinping is that he really does take Marxism seriously. And as you says, he uses historical materialism to argue that ultimately the West is in decline, while China is inevitably going to be rising. And that shapes, I think, his worldview. And I think it has serious ramifications for global politics and what China's actions are going to be within the global order.
We know that Xi Jinping, his Chinese dream is linked with globalization. However, the containment from the U.S., as well as extreme weather conditions, the war between Russia and Ukraine, and the greater food shortage and the ongoing pandemic have all made it more difficult for Xi to realize his Chinese dream. So, Professor, you mentioned that China needs to have good luck. And do you think Xi will get his luck after the 20th National Congress? Or will the Chinese dream be nothing but a dream?
Yeah, or will it be a nightmare? I think that's one of the challenges. I think if we look at policy moving forward, if there's not some significant shifts in terms of domestic economic policy, it's going to be very problematic to get the kind of growth that China desires to fulfill all its obligations for social welfare investment, for maintaining a stronger military to resist what it sees as the threats from the United States of America and its allies. And that, I think, is going to be a problem. And the reason I say it's a problem is that a lot of the investment from China, the state-led investment, does not really go to the most effective parts of the economy, the private sector, which you referred to earlier. And we know that total factor productivity is much lower in the state sector. With the ongoing impact of the war, of COVID, et cetera, China will be lucky to get any growth this year. And moving forward, if it continues with the zero COVID policies and it doesn't make any significant shift in terms of its economic strategy, I think we're looking at a very low growth rate, maybe 2%, 3%. The question is then about the quality of growth. I mean, China doesn't need the high growth of the past. I mean, those days are gone. The Chinese Communist Party knows that. But it does need good quality growth. And if it could get that at 4 or 5%, that could be pretty effective. But I mean, all these things are going to frustrate attainment of the dream if it has much lower levels of economic growth, and if the debt mountain continues to climb. And that's also been an issue pre-Congress, the kind of stimulus and other measures that China has undertaken really push a whole load of problems to the post-Congress period. And let me make there one comment related to the new leadership. If we look at those that Xi tends to appoint, they tend to be supporters, followers, and acolytes. They don't tend to be people with special technical and policy skills. They tend to be more bureaucrats and apparatchiks. And that concerns me because of what we're just talking about, that these post-Congress challenges are quite severe. And do they have the kind of policymakers there who can develop effective policies? And perhaps even more importantly, does Xi Jinping suffer from the kind of Putin syndrome, that no one around him would be willing to say, no, this is wrong. We have to make a change. We have to shift policy. And the way he's centralized power over the last 10 years would indicate to me that that is pretty unlikely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. During your interview with other media, I saw that you say that using force for Taiwan's reunification is not Xi's most urgent option, and the only trigger will be Taiwan's independence. Based on your observation, if Taiwan really declares independence, will the U.S. defend Taiwan's security? And many people have said that Taiwan is the most dangerous place in the world now, and Taiwan could be the flashpoint for the World War III. What do you make of this?
I think in the U.S., if the provocation was instigated by Taiwan through a formal declaration of independence, I think it would be difficult for the United States to pull enough support from its population to come to aid Taiwan in the event of a military invasion. That does not mean, of course, it might not provide other kinds of support, but not necessarily strong military support. Should it be the reverse, where the invasion comes unprompted from the mainland, then I think the US would consider quite seriously what kinds of military actions it could undertake and the very high levels of sanctions it could impose. But I think it will be a difficult job to persuade the US population. In some ways, I think the presentation of the invasion of Ukraine has been somewhat easier to explain to the US population. Somehow Europe is sort of considered part of the areas that the US is engaged with. I think somehow Asia, for some people's minds, just seems so much more remote. And as you've seen, there are people in the US who discuss, is defense of Taiwan really in the national interest? Well, I think you can argue not just on the moral grounds and on the grounds of defending, a democracy which has grown mature. I think there is a strategic issue there that were the mainland to gain control over Taiwan and related islands, that could pose a severe security threat to the US presence in the Pacific. So I think there is both the moral, economic, and strategic grounds for the US supporting Taiwan.
Thank you very much, Professor Tony Sach, for sharing so valuable views with our audience here in Taiwan. And we look forward to see you very soon in Taipei. Thank you and goodbye. Thank you, Professor.